Good morning. I'm Warren Hogue, IPI's Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this policy forum on the importance of multilateralism in sustaining global peace. Co-sponsoring this meeting with IPI are the Elders, the independent international gathering of notable senior stateswomen and men, peace activists, and human rights advocates brought together in 2007 by Nelson Mandela. There are 9 active elders, and we have the great honor of hosting 4 of them here today. You have their full biographies in your papers, so let me mention them briefly just in the order in which they will speak. Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations and Nobel Prize laureate, who is the group's chair. Gro Harlem Brundtland, the first woman Prime Minister of Norway and former Director General of the World Health Organization, who is the Elders' Deputy Chair. Lakhdar Brahimi, former UN and Arab League Special Envoy to Syria and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Algeria. And Maryann Robinson, the first woman President of Ireland and former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now that's a lot of formers. But I can report to you that they are currently very active in putting their broad experience and considerable stature to work in the service of promoting dialogue and building peace and supporting efforts to alleviate human suffering, particularly caused by extreme poverty, injustice, or intolerance. As you can see from this turnout, what they have to say draws attention. They've come to New York to meet with the new Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and we are really pleased that they worked this visit to IPI into their schedule. We had originally planned this session for last February. I think some of you had accepted it back then. And we had to postpone it when 2 of the elders were felled by the flu and were unable to fly. We were really, really disappointed by that and feared we had missed the opportunity to see them, though they assured us they would come up with a new date. This week, I ran across a message between us from that time in which they said, we'll try for mid-May. They are clearly a group true to their word because it's May 9th, and here they are. Both parts of our subject today are dear to us at IPI. Though we are a research organization, not an advocacy group, 2 things we advocate openly are multilateralism and sustaining peace. From 2014 to 2016, we conducted an ambitious research project here examining whether the multilateral system embodied in the United Nations was fit for purpose, publishing a report timed to come out this past September just as a new Secretary General was being selected. We called it the Independent Commission on Multilateralism. And in our peace building and peace operations research, we have adopted the rubric of sustaining peace, a phrase which seeks to reclaim peace in its own right and detach it from the subservient affiliation with conflict that has defined it over the past 4 decades. Sustaining peace seeks to place greater emphasis on detecting and strengthening what is already working, not only what is in disrepair and needs fixing. Each of our distinguished guests will be speaking to individual parts of this broad agenda, and then we will turn to you, our audience, for questions. So to start us off, it gives me the enormous pleasure to turn this conversation over to a man I covered as a journalist and then befriended as a person, Kofi Annan.
Thank you very much, Warren and dear friends. We are very happy. We are very happy to be here with you this morning to discuss the topic of multilateralism. Yesterday, we had a very good discussion with the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. I was going to say the new Secretary General. It's 5 months, it's not that new anymore. And really also expressed our full support for him and whatever we can do to help. We live in a world where we are confronted with many challenges, from climate change, terrorism, inequality, and a whole series of issues. And none of these problems can be resolved by any one country, however powerful and however confident that country or the leader is. We need to work across national borders to resolve these issues in a sustainable manner. And so we were very happy to discuss some of these issues with the Secretary General, from Syria to the African crisis, to the Iran nuclear issue and the Korean crisis. And we believe that as difficult as the world is today, and as divisive as it's proven to be in certain areas, we really need to make every effort to support multilateralism and to sustain cooperations across borders. The UN is the only institution that I know that can help handle some of these crises and bring people together. And I think we have had good examples recently, which indicates that the solution is not necessarily military. Let me use Iran as an example. We went through sanctions. We had acrimonious discussions. But eventually we got an agreement. It was not the threats or military action, it was engagement that brought results. And the same type of engagement is what is going to be required eventually to resolve North Korea. So I would hope one would not dismiss diplomacy as irrelevant or as something that doesn't yield results. It's slow, I agree. But what is the alternative? And hopefully, I see the debate going on in Washington, and I've been quite touched that those defending diplomacy are the men in uniform, which is really quite something. And in a way, I'm not surprised, and I will tell you, when I took over as head of peacekeeping at the UN, I went into that operation with a conventional wisdom that the war was too serious a matter to be left to the generals. I left the peacekeeping operations with another insight. Declaration of war was too serious a matter to be left to the politicians and the diplomats alone. The tough questions were always posed by the generals. Do you know what this means? Do you know what you're going to do to my boys? Do you know the number of people who are going to die? How long is this mission to take? And what is the end game? And it all came from the military. You don't get those sort of questions necessarily from the civilians and the diplomats. And the military are trained to do what-if analysis. So normally they would do both nightmare scenarios and rosy scenarios and work their way. But anyway, so I'm saying I'm not surprised that the soldiers are now telling us the first line of defense is diplomacy, and that we should stick to that and work together with other nations. Because in our complex and interconnected world and the nature of the challenges we are facing, a unilateral approach, viewing conflicts as a zero-sum game, is analogous to commercial deal-making. And of course, I'm saying this because there's lots of debate about making deals. The deals one makes in real estate and others is fine. You can make a deal with somebody, sell them a house, and not see them again in the rest of your life. But when it comes to diplomacy and internationally, you need relationship. You need to sustain that relationship to be able to continue tomorrow if you don't get a solution today. If you don't have a relationship, each time you meet, you are starting from afresh. The other thing I would want to say is I'm very happy to see people from different aspects of different parts of society getting into government. There has always been a sense that public servants are not as efficient as private sector people, not as efficient as businessmen. I think that is also something that we need to be careful about and debunk. I have seen men and women move from the private sector to the public sector and vice versa. From my experience, a private sector person moving to the political sector often finds it much more difficult than the other way around. Why is it more difficult? It's more difficult because they don't have the managerial autonomy, the focused objective of maximizing profits. And you realize each time you have to take a decision, you consult. You need consensus. Frustration level goes up. This is waste of time. Why do I have to talk to everybody and his cousin before I take a decision? But that is the nature of public life, and that is the nature of diplomacy. I know that people sometimes believe the UN talks a lot, and it's jaw, and no action. But I often say that when you bring that many countries together, you cannot impose a decision on them. You will need to have serious discussion. And besides, we accept that if a scientist is doing an experiment and starts with a hypothesis and goes through 100 experiments, but only one succeeds, he's brilliant. We don't say the 99 times was a waste. The same goes for us. We do lots of talking, but periodically we come up with something. And that is our creative redundancy, the talking. So you have to be patient with us. I think I will pause here and not say too much. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to Gru Harlem Brundtland. I want to tell you that it's from my experience around the UN, I really think that multilateralism is in the DNA of you Norwegians. As you know, here at IPI, our president, Terje Rød-Larsen, is Norwegian. And our close identification with Nordic countries, just look around you. Blonde wood, the chairs you're sitting on are Danish, the walls are white, cheerful, and we even have a birch tree in the corner. Dr. Brundtland, and I call you doctor because I know you are a medical doctor as well as everything else you've done. How can multilateralism promote good governance?
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here again. It's on. Oh, it has to be close. Yes?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Now, how can you govern a world somehow that is diversified with nearly 200 nations and different religions, unless you have multilateralism? There is no way, there is no alternative way. As the world grows closer and closer together, we are dependent on each other with all the new and increasing issues that are on our tables. So the governance question is important at country level, of course, even at municipal and local levels. We all know that. And it will be illustrated by what happens now in following up the Sustainable Development Goals. But let me just go back to, as you said, Norway and the other Nordic, Scandinavian countries. They all have had a very strong connection and conviction about the importance of the UN, because we understand as small countries and peaceful democracies that the only way to prevail and to build peace is through multilateralism. So we have been staunch supporters of United Nations from the very start. Now, as I then worked as an environment minister, the first thing, I came from health. I was a public health specialist. I was asked to do environment as a minister of the Norwegian government, 1974. And I thought, my goodness, I'm not a specialist on this. But it very soon was clear to me that why are we concerned about the environment more than anything else? Because of human beings. I mean, we are concerned to take care of the environment and to look at the relationship between people and nature because we are concerned about human rights, human health, and humanity's future. So the whole background of looking at people as it is linked to environment was obvious. And there is no other way as environmental issues, pollution, changes due to climate change, there's no way to deal with those issues without having international agreements about it. It was obvious from the very start. Now then, of course, when you look at the challenge I got in 1983 from the UN to lead a global commission, it was, again, the focus was environment. We are not seriously and sufficiently taking care of the drama, the damage that is increasingly hitting our environment. That was a global issue that more and more people became concerned about. But I knew from my previous experience as a Minister of Environment, having worked across the world with countries from other continents than Europe, I knew that there is no way to save and protect the environment without taking care of people and development, overcoming poverty, because otherwise people will cut trees. Otherwise, there is no way to save the environment and safeguard planet Earth than when humanity is given dignity, opportunities for women and men alike. So we are right into the human rights perspective as you look at this. Now, then we had a great year, many years later than the World Commission on Environment and Development, which gave its report and formulated sustainable development in 1987. It took 28 years until the year 2015, where everyone here is aware it was a year of multilateralism succeeding in two major areas. Sustainable Development Goals in September in this city, and then in Paris. However, we are now 17, and we all, I think most of us across the globe, applauded what was happening in 2015, because finally we had multilateralism in critical areas for humanity's future and for planet Earth and its future. Now we have to struggle to take care of these developments and these results of 2015, because there are setbacks and there are challenges against them. And now, having said all this, I know that Mary is the next to speak, and I'm sure you will hear the follow-up from her.
Actually, Lakhdar Brahimi is the next to speak.
Oh, sorry. Well, she still is coming.
But she can,
You're right.
by the time she speaks, we will not have forgotten what she said by introducing her. Lakhdar Brahimi, as we know well here at the UN, you devoted much of your life to conflict resolution. We used to think you had retired, and then Kofi Annan and then Ban Ki-moon would always find something new for you to do, and you came back. We're always glad that you came back, as we're very glad that you're here today. Can you talk about conflict resolution and specifically about how the international community can help ease the world's largest humanitarian disaster and bring some kind of peace to Syria?
In our globalized world, apparently we say that conflict, new generation, the present generation of conflicts takes place in individual countries, not between countries. But somehow we always forget, although we have seen this happening again and again and again, that a conflict, yes, does start in one country. It involves only the nationals of those countries the first few days, but it never fails to spill over, never. It spills over because the conflict will go out, and also because other countries interfere in that conflict. Unfortunately, we have always forgotten that, and we have practically always waited until the conflict has become regional or even international before we really do something effective about it. I think that conflict these days shows how indispensable the United Nations is. If you can see practically all interventions that take place outside the United Nations end up in failures and sometimes in catastrophic failures. So let's just dream 2 minutes. Let's dream that in 1989, when the Russians left Afghanistan, the international community, through the Security Council, really went and helped the Afghan people organize themselves rather than start a new civil war. 9/11 wouldn't have happened. Let's also dream a little bit nearer to us that in 2011, when the first demonstrations started in Syria and the first repression started, instead of dividing ourselves into people saying the regime in Syria must stay, and other people saying the regime in Syria must end today, if we had gone together and told the Syrians, yes, change is necessary, and let's see if we can help you make that change, then 1 million refugees wouldn't have swamped all over Europe in 2016. So I hope that we will learn the lesson, and that the Security Council will do what it has been created to do, and that is work together, not for the national interests of each one of the 5 members, but for the common good. And again, if we are a global village, surely we can think of quite a few things that are common to us and work together. So Syria is a horrible tragedy. You know why? Very, very simple. Because the people who have gone in have put the interest of the Syrian people at best in the second place, at best. They have gone in for very, very selfish national private interests. And the interests of the Syrian people have come second or none at all. So I think if we now, what's happening in Astana is encouraging. What has happened in Geneva at long last is starting to be a little promising. If we now get together and say, let's see how we can help the Syrian people reorganize themselves, preserve their unity, and build reconcile and try to come out of the ditch in which they have thrown themselves, and we have helped them stay there and dig further, as a matter of fact. So I think this is what needs to be done. Security Council act responsibly to do the job they have been created in 1945 to do, and not to speak about Russian interests, American interests, Chinese interests, French interests, British interests. Those interests will be served to the full in Syria if we really think of the interest of the Syrian people. If we are ready to do that, I think the Syrian problem will be resolved very, very, very soon. Thank you very much.
Finally, Maryann Robinson, like the protection of human rights, which you spent so much time addressing, by definition, the problems of climate change and migration know no borders. Clearly, this is a job for multilateralism, yes?
Yes, indeed. And I, too, am very happy to be back here at IPI and speaking to this very knowledgeable audience. I've been looking at the biographies, or at least the accounts of who's in this audience. I'd like to build very much on what Gru was saying about 2015 being a very good year for multilateralism. And I want to just particularly focus on the Paris Climate Agreement in addressing issues of climate and migration. The Paris Climate Agreement was an extraordinary agreement for the 195 countries who negotiated and adopted it, because it wasn't foreseeable that we would get what was in the Paris Agreement. Even a week before Paris, it wasn't foreseeable that we would get well below 2 degrees Celsius and working for 1.5 as the goals, that we would get a long-term goal of being carbon neutral before the end of the century. And I remember the extraordinary reaction when the gavel came down. I was there. It was very emotional. I'm sure some people here in the audience were there. The clapping went on, and then it became cheering, and then it became hugging, and then it became crying. It was quite extraordinary. And it was because that messy multilateral negotiation over so long had resulted in a fair agreement. Not a very strong agreement, but a fair one. And it was fair because people had listened to the presidents of small island states, listened to countries like Bangladesh talking about the need to stay at 1.5. And eventually, a sense of fairness became the dominant feature with a coalition on high ambition. But there was another narrative happening in our world. And that narrative was a much more divisive one, a populist one, and very much focusing on those who felt left out by globalization. Left out because they'd either lost their jobs or feared losing their jobs. They also feared the other and were encouraged by politicians to fear the other in populist trends, to fear the migrants, to fear those coming into the country. And we saw this very much in Europe. It was very much a factor in Brexit. Both the left out and feeling that somehow we need to return to old ways where our jobs are more secure, and also the fear of migrants. We saw it in the election in this country of President Trump. I'm actually the first person on this panel to mention President Trump. I'm delighted about that. Usually he comes up earlier. So we've had this divisive, negative time when hate speech and anger and a lack of civility have become a kind of norm. And I think it's really important that we reassert the importance of multilateralism, the importance of the listening to each other that can happen at the international level and must happen if we're going to solve big problems. And I'm glad that the United Nations was able last September to host a major day on refugees and migrants. Kofi beside me will remember that migration couldn't be talked about in the UN system. I remember as High Commissioner being very worried about the fact that we just couldn't talk about migration. We couldn't, but we managed to have a day of high discussion and an agreement to have 2 global compacts, a global compact on refugees and a global compact on fair migration. And we have to change the narrative on both, but particularly on migration, over the next 2 years, because the Global Compact has to be completed by the end of next year. And I think this is a good example of a further commitment to solving big problems by negotiation and listening to the diverse views and building a more positive narrative of managing migration, because that is what we need to do. And so I'm going to stop here because I think we should open this up for questions from you and further discussion. But I think there's a very real need to understand those who do feel left behind and have what in climate terms we call a just transition for those who are now having to move from the fossil fuel industry to renewable energy. They do need to be thought about, to be retrained, to be at the centre of our attention. But the populist narrative that's appealing to those who are left out in terms of a nationalism, in terms of a country being first and promoting that country is not the way. We just have to reimagine the spirit of multilateralism that we had in 2015. We still have the 2030 agenda, the Paris Climate Agreement, the striving for global compacts now on refugees and migrants. These are the ways that we must use to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to the audience now. You know, I find these days that every dinner conversation, every conversation with friends begins with a pledge not to talk about Trump, and it lasts about 5 minutes. As Maryann Robinson pointed out, ours lasted 25 minutes. But having said that, I heard the presence of Trump and the menace that he represents in the comments of both Guru Brundtland and Kofi Annan. We'd love to get some questions now. Raise your hands, I'll call on you. And if you would identify yourself, wait for the microphone. We are being webcast, by the way. That's why the microphone is so important. And I think if the panel is okay, I'll do 3 questions at once and then we'll answer them as 3. Louise, I see you there. Bill. And here, John Hirsch, my colleague in the front row.
Good morning, Louise Allen from the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. Thank you so much. It's such an amazing way to start a Tuesday morning. I was wondering whether you could comment on the role of civil society in promoting multilateralism, conflict prevention, and pushing for progressive resolutions and outcomes within all the different UN systems. Thank you.
Bill Pace.
Thank you, Bill Pace with WFM and the Institute for Global Policy. First, I wanted to ask if in your discussions with the Secretary General or the elders will continue to support strongly, as Secretary General Annan did and Bond did, the role of international justice and the rule of law and the ending impunity as a fundamental part of the multilateralism's legitimacy and integrity. And then I wanted to ask the panel, coming back a little bit to Syria and the conflict prevention issue, was if you could comment on where there was some key efforts that got off the track. For example, the General Assembly asked Kofi to take on a role, but then that was undermined, as I understand it. And in the situation, you had governments who were committed to the language and the policies, which my organization finds enormously crude, of so-called regime change, where you do need new governments, you need better governments, you need government reform, but the term of regime change, which still dominates the dialogue in this continent and I think in lots of Europe. But you had populations that did not want a political settlement at the time. And how does the UN, with its diplomacy, address those populations and at the same time is able to avoid the catastrophe of the last 11 years?
Thank you, Bill. John Hirsch. Microphone's coming to you.
First of all, thank you all so much for everything you've done in the world for so long a period of time. Just great to have you all here. I want to ask you to say something about what is happening on the African continent and what the multilateral agenda can do about it. My impression is that parts of Africa are very stable, and you have relatively few people trying to go into Europe from southern Africa. So why is that the case? Then in contrast, we have most of these individuals who are risking their lives to enter Europe coming from Eastern Africa and to a lesser extent from West Africa. So what is it? What's going on? Why is this happening in this way? And try to be more specific, or what can the United Nations system and the African Union do to deal with those countries from which people are fleeing all the time? South Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and so on. Thank you very much.
All right, fine. I think in the interest of time, I'll try to select one person to answer each question. And let me start with the third question from Bill Pace about Syrian regime change, because you actually mentioned Kofi Annan, so I'm going to ask Kofi if he would answer that question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Warren. I think the Lakhdar has already commented on the Syrian issue. I believe we had a mixed opportunity in June 2012 when the Geneva Communique was signed. The whole rationale behind the Geneva Communique was in a way something that Lakhdar alluded to. I felt that to solve the Syrian crisis, given the numerous parties involved, it was important to bring everybody together around the table, eventually get them to agree on a common approach. First of all, to realize that nobody was going to win in that war. Syria was going to be destroyed. It's going to be detrimental to all involved. So I thought if they came together, agreed a common framework, a common solution, and worked together towards it, they will succeed. That is what led to the Geneva Communique. And the key paragraph in the Geneva Communique was a need for a transitional government with full executive powers. There was a debate between the Russians and the West. Assad must go, the West kept repeating, but they had no means of getting him to go. In the meantime, the war went on. The Russians argued, we cannot afford a chaotic collapse. We have to have an arrangement for, and so this is why the transitional paragraph came in. And haven't agreed on that, and it was signed by all of them. Lavrov signed it, Hillary Clinton, all the foreign ministers signed it. They were to come to New York, and through the Security Council build on it. They came to New York and started pointing fingers at each other and accusing each other, and really missed the opportunity. That is when I realized that I didn't have the support as a mediator that I needed, and that I seemed to be more serious about it than the Security Council that gave me the job. And as I often say, a mediator cannot want peace more than those who gave him the job or the protagonist. We need to work together. So anyway, they dropped the ball. When I resigned, I told my staff, don't worry, tomorrow the council and others will be where I am today. And I thought tomorrow wouldn't take more than 3 months, but tomorrow took 3 years. It was not until December 2015 that they got together in Vienna and reaffirmed the Geneva Communique. And obviously, the situation is much more complicated, was much more complicated then and now than it was in 2012. And of course, in those days, some people thought they could win the war, but it was obvious to me as a mediator that given the balance of forces on the ground, there was no way either side was going to win or in a position to give a knockout punch. So that, for me, was a big missed opportunity, and I think some of those involved admit it today. On the question of rule of law, I can assure you that we as elders will support the rule of law and respect for human rights. I personally believe that you cannot have a democratic and healthy society unless you build it on 3 pillars: peace and security, inclusive development, and respect for rule of law and human rights. And these 3 pillars reinforce each other, and we will continue to support that. Thank you.
Gru Harlem Brundtland, the role of civil society that was asked about Can you speak to that?
It is obvious that governments alone cannot be in charge of development efforts and our work together. And growing over decades, there has been a greater civil society approach, not only in the Western world, where it all started, but across the world now. It's a strong force, and with social media helping connect people across the world, civil society has a greater ability to reach minds, and certainly to reach young people, the coming generations, because they can connect with civil society and with each other using social media. So during our lifetimes, this has been a growing force of good in so many areas. And I saw, when I led the World Commission on Environment and Development, the importance of working with all sectors of society, business, industry, but of course, all the aspects of the whole agenda of the sustainable development. It's working with civil society, and in addition to governments, was essential. And you could see it in Rio in '92. There was a great assembly of civil society across the world. And this, it's just essential. And during the time of Kofi Annan here in the UN, of course, there was also reform processes, changing and improving the relationship between civil society also and the UN, which also helped many governments understand, although not everyone has understood it yet. The whole aspect of working government, civil society, business is also what made Paris, by the way, possible.
Lakhdar Brahimi, you're the other member of the panel here from the continent of Africa. Could you take up John Hirsch's question about migrations and South Africa and East Africa?
I think John knows Africa better than I do. So I think there is no doubt that from Africa or elsewhere, the biggest source of migration and refugees is conflict. The people who went to Europe in 2016, the largest number was from Syria. The second largest was not from Iraq or Eritrea, or it was from Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's true.
So from Africa, I think they have three sources why people get on the move. Conflict first. Second is malgovernance. So conflict, Somalia, South Sudan. Malgovernance, Eritrea. You have a lot of Eritreans running away because they have, a government which is extremely difficult and complicated. The other thing is that, unfortunately, there are quite a few people also from West Africa. Quite a few. The third reason why is poverty. So I think this is why, these are the things that the international community should attend to. See if you can reduce poverty. That has been done a little bit these last few years, but it's not enough, and it's not all over in every country or every part of the world. The second thing, improve government. And above all, and perhaps most urgently, try to do something about conflict, where conflict exists.
Thank you. Maryann Robinson, Bill Pace's question was dealing specifically about international tribunals, international courts. You must have had experience with them in your human rights work and otherwise. Could you speak to that question, please?
And regime change, yes.
Obviously, I was serving as High Commissioner for Human Rights when the International Criminal Court was brought about, and Bill and many civil society organisations played a huge role in that. And I think it's really important. I'm glad that the elders quite recently reaffirmed the importance of the International Criminal Court, but that it needs reform, and that the permanent members of the Security Council should all be paid up members, if you like, of the International Criminal Court, if it's to work efficiently and effectively as it should. And it is part of the importance of rule of law. I very much agree with the points that have been made, and with Kofi's point about it being utterly fundamental. I actually serve on the board and the prize committee of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and we have an index of governance in African countries, and it's a website that's well worth visiting, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, all one word, .org, because the website really sets out over about 15 years now, the progress or lack of progress of countries, and it's really interesting to see, measured on a wide range of criteria, how you can actually assess. I think it would be very good if we had in the Americas and if we had in Europe a similar way of measuring and having countries look at how other countries are doing in their neighbourhood, in their region, as African countries now do. You have West African countries looking at how other countries are doing, and it's a model of a good index for African countries, but actually we could do with measuring progress of that kind in other countries as well, in other regions of the world as well, including in North America.
We'll get more questions. I'll take three more. I'm going to go to the back of the room. Jeff Laurenti, and I'll come to the front room for Ann Phillips, and then over here, and then on the left. So 1, 2, 3. He's back there behind you.
Hi, Jeff Laurenti. First, it is great to see a collection of people who, through the 90s and the first decade of this century, have provided such powerful and persuasive leadership for the world community. I wanted to pick up on Maryann Robinson's bold mention of Trump to ask, really, is the current travails with the new regime in Washington all that different from the oscillations we had in the 80s with the Reagan people, and in the early years, I guess they call it the noughts or aughts of this century with the Bush-Cheney crowd? And don't they get tamed in the end? Is it, Reagan had started off against human rights as a major factor of policy and then came around in a certain sort of way. What is different about the Trump kind of regime, in your view, with your fine historical perspective? And is it perhaps not a benefit that he didn't seem to have any coherent plan coming in at all, unlike the others who had plans? And do you see the Chinese or others beginning to fill the gap of whatever may be these oscillations in American leadership, in quotes, in the UN system?
The second is here in the front row. Mary Robinson, aren't you sorry now that you mentioned Trump?
I promise you I won't. First of all, I too want to thank all of you for the wonderful work you've done and really trying to make the world a better place. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Just hold it closer to your mouth.
Oh, close. I should know by now.
Yeah.
I hope you heard me thank these people for the wonderful work that they've done in their effort to make the world a better place. In November, I think it was in 1989, our wonderful Secretary General introduced another concept of multilateralism, which was humanitarian intervention, which evolved into a new way of calling it the R2P, responsibility to protect. At that point, I felt so elated that humanity had reached this level of really wanting to do something like that after the horrors of the 20th century and the total disregard of the egregious behavior towards many of the citizens of the world in that period. Now we've entered a new era, as you alluded to before, of selfishness, nationalism, anti-globalism. Do you think that the UN can do anything to reignite the fire, if you will, of this wonderful concept of yours?
And finally,
good morning. My name is Mel Duncan from Nonviolent Peace Force. Climate disruption especially access to water, is an increasing driver of conflict. We've seen this from Syria to Standing Rock. My question is two parts. First, what are you seeing out there that is promising for governments, for local communities at resolving these conflicts nonviolently? And secondly, what are you recommending to the UN in terms of an approach that will break down the silos and have a integrated approach, whether it be through UNDP and UNICEF, but also through the Department of Peacekeeping and the Department of Political Affairs, so that especially local communities are equipped to prevent violent conflicts and transform these conflicts to nonviolent approaches?
Fine. On the first question from Jeff Laurenti, whether we like it or not, the most important relationship the most important national relationship the United Nations has is with the United States. Jeff mentioned the problem and past problems. Maryann Robinson, since you're guilty of bringing up Trump's name, could you address the way Jeffrey put it? I mean, do you think it's worse now than it was in those past periods?
I think it's a very interesting question. We think it's worse because it's immediate and it's now, and there's a lot of tweeting, and there's a certain sense of being disturbed by the unpredictable nature of this administration. But I do agree that it's clear that there are experienced advisors, and I agree with Kofi that a number of them are generals who are advising Trump, and that he does seem to listen at times and to learn. At the moment, I'm aware that he is getting a huge barrage of lobbying by corporations not to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And that is really very interesting. In a way, because Trump is so unpredictable and disruptive in that sense, he has also galvanized civil society. We've seen marches all over the place. We've seen much more interest in politics in young people because of the election of President Trump. And we're seeing in the business sector that is particularly non-fossil fuel, but even some of the fossil fuel business, a real sense of the urgency of the United States not isolating itself on the important issue of climate change and not becoming a rogue state, because that is really what the United States would become if it did pull out of the Paris Agreement, because as a major emitter, it has a responsibility, and it's signed up to that responsibility. And to pull out of it would be an appalling step in our very connected world, where people are aware that the United States has a responsibility. I would call it a grave injustice, because I have a foundation on climate justice, which recognizes that it's the poorest countries and communities that are the most affected. So I think that it's still early in the Trump administration. I think there's a learning curve going on, and I think we have to be hopeful that the learning curve will be favorable towards multilateralism. And indeed, in our discussions with the Secretary General, he clearly sees that the Trump administration, and in particular the United States representative on the Security Council, have been, more positive than his worst fears, and certainly he's able to work very well with Nikki Haley. So we have hopes.
The silver lining that those of us with a history with the failing New York Times has is that President Trump has pretty much doubled our circulation. We're slowly running out of time, but I wanted the question from Ann Phillips about how the United Nations can reignite that spirit we once saw here. No better person to talk to about that than Kofi Annan. Would you take that on? And also, if I could just ask you, Kofi, when you talked to Antonio Guterres, I'm sure he talked about ways that he thinks he can reignite that spirit. If you could make reference to that, that would be great.
No, thank you very much, Anne, for that question. I think you are right. There was lots of hope when the responsibility to protect was adopted. And I think Libya did us lots of damage, the way the Libya operations were handled. And it became a real issue even during the Syrian negotiations. I tried to get the Security Council to impose arms embargo on Syria. The Russians and the Chinese said, no way, it's a slippery slope. We'll be confronted with another Libya. We abstained, we didn't vote against Libya. We were to go in and to help the people, but it suddenly became regime change. I think it's going to take a while to live down that, and we need to find a way of really engaging to get people to understand that you can indeed go in and help the people without threatening military action or actually taking military action. I think the Kenya crisis of 2007-2008 was a good example of responsibility to protect. All regions worked with me, the US, the European Union, the African Union, and we all worked together using political and diplomatic pressure to get the leaders to bend and form a national government, which ended the killings. By then, 1,300 people had been killed, 650,000 people had been uprooted from their homes. But using that concept and everybody pulling together, we were able to stop it without even referring to military action. I think the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is focusing very much on prevention and is hoping he will get the member states to back him up on this and really energize UN's activities on prevention, which also will lead into R2P. I would hope that a moment will come when they will have another rallying event to bring everybody together to put new life into the protection of individuals. And it is very much needed today when we see what's happening in our world. And so we should support our Secretary General. Thank you.
I am terribly sorry to say we are almost out of time right now. And I know there's so many more questions. I wish we could take them. We just have no more time, I know. Well, quickly, we have a Facebook question. Quickly from Hillary. We literally have 1 minute.
Thank you so much. We have about 10,000 views on Facebook, so we have to get one of these in. Sry Volyak asks, what are the ways in which citizens of a nation unite to demand their basic human rights be met when governments do their utmost best to silence people? I'm sorry.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. What are the ways citizens can do their citizens of a nation can unite to demand their basic human rights be met when a government is doing the utmost to silence them?
I'm not sure I got it. You know?
Well, it's just, I think it's about what can the UN do when the government itself is suppressing people's right to speak up and act. And
I think, in my experience, even in the most repressive regimes, on the ground, there are people struggling for their human rights defenders, and they can be teachers and they can be housewives, but they are there struggling and fighting. And it was always possible to meet with civil society. I'd like to build on what Guru said about the importance of civil society, but also say, and this maybe is more relevant to the question, we are seeing the shrinking of civil society space in a lot of countries. We're seeing laws that are much more restrictive in a lot of countries, including some developed countries. We're seeing a cutting off of funding, especially from the outside, that was very important for civil society groups in countries. And these are difficult issues, and we need to understand how important it is to struggle against them.
Please.
I think Mary has put it very clearly, but what is important is that the civil society organizations, you've been able to link up internationally and taken up courses. I think you should continue to work together. You should continue to not network and support each other. There is strength in unity. Mary is absolutely right. There are attempts by governments to silence civil society, cut off funding, question their legitimacy, and so they do need support. possibly from friendly governments, but amongst yourselves, stay together and network.
They are on a tight schedule, and we right now have an interview next door scheduled. So I have to ask your indulgence. We're going to leave and go directly back to that room. But before we do that, please join me in thanking them, not just for their participation today, but as several speakers have pointed out, for the extraordinary contributions they have made to the causes we most care about.